Before I begin this video, or rather before I start discussing the issues that this video brings up, the actual information, the news, I'm going to just again repeat a warning that I've unfortunately had to make before. It's been brought to my attention that again all kinds of people have been opening up various channels on YouTube, using bits and bobs of things that I've said on my programs and passing off these channels as connected in some way with myself. Let me say again repeatedly that the people who are doing this have no connection to me, no connection to the Duran, are not authorized to do this, and that the only channels where you can find my content are this one and the Duran itself, though of course I do occasionally appear as a guest on other channels, and you can find me on those channels from time to time. But these channels, these phony channels as I'm going to call them, have absolutely nothing to do with me. It's unfortunately becoming a rather tiresome matter, having to bring this up repeatedly and having to try to take steps to clear out these people, but there it is. Anyway, if you happen to see a channel that purports to be connected to myself, which isn't this one or the Duran, you know it's bogus. Now, with that, let me press on with the news. And before I deal with today's news, can I now cover an issue, a story that has been floating around now for several days, which is about the drone strike on the air base in Belarus and the claims that a Russian AWACS aircraft, an A-50U mainstay, was either destroyed on that airbase as a result of that drone attack or was damaged as a result of that drone attack, seriously damaged according to some claims. And of course there were also all kinds of other claims that this attack was the work of Belarusian partisans. And I've already made clear my own complete disbelief, entire skepticism of that latter claim. Anyway, those reports that this Russian AWACS aircraft had been damaged have been circulating for several days. They've appeared in many Western media outlets. There's always been, and I have to say this, some qualifications on these reports. In these reports, they've all said that this has not been fully corroborated. The way in which the stories have been covered and the prominence that they've been given by the media, especially in Britain, suggests that the media has believed that the plane really was attacked and really was damaged in the way that was claimed. And the British Ministry of Defence, to what I suspect will be its considerable future embarrassment, even published an intelligence update, also, it must be said, in fairness, qualifying what it was saying about the damage to this A-50U mainstay AWACS aircraft, but reporting it again as if reporting it in a way which appeared to give credence to the claims that it had indeed been attacked and damaged, and going into considerable length as to the implications of this for the Russian military operation in Ukraine in the event that the claims turned out to be true. And again, I can't help but think that the person who drafted that intelligence update must have assumed that the reports were true. I have to say, by the way, that I find that interesting, and it does suggest that British intelligence might not be quite as effective as some of us think. Perhaps the British don't have quite as many spies in the sky, satellites and such things, as we all of us thought, because satellite photos have now appeared of that airbase. And they appear to show, I mean, I'm never one who's able to see photographs, especially satellite photographs. I can't see them very clearly, but as far as I can see, the plane, the 850U mainstay AWACS aircraft, is indeed there on the base, and it shows no visible sign of damage, at least no sign of damage that I can see. Now, coming from me, maybe that's not particularly authoritative. I do, as I've said, have eyesight issues. I find it very difficult to read maps, for example, or, by the way, to read numbers. And I find it very difficult to study and analyze photographs. But others have said the same thing, people who I presume have both more expertise in this area and, to say it bluntly, better eyesight. All of them say that this aircraft looks intact. So, conclusion that I'm coming to is that there was some kind of a drone attack on this airbase. Almost certainly it was launched from Ukraine. Almost certainly it did target this particular aircraft, and almost certainly, in fact, it seems to me, definitely, the attack failed. The drones were probably shot down or intercepted or brought down by electronic warfare means. We'll come to that in a moment. And the attack failed. Now, I say all of that. I'm going to make two further points. Firstly, that the satellite pictures came from the United States, from, I believe, a company called Maxar. They circulated, that they were circulating yesterday, but for several hours later, some newspapers, especially in Britain, I'm not going to embarrass them by saying which, were still running with the story about the damaged Russian AWACS aircraft, apparently oblivious to the fact that these photographs were out, which I find again surprising. It suggests that the editorial teams at these newspapers no longer work as they once did. To my absolute knowledge, once upon a time, if satellite photos of this nature had appeared, there would have been almost immediately action taken to take down stories that appeared on a newspaper that appeared to have been refuted by these pictures. But, well, for whatever reason, and one can speculate as one wishes, that doesn't seem to happen anymore. But I'm going to finish by saying that despite the presence of these satellite pictures, I'm going to predict that this story with some people is going to continue to run. They will continue to claim that the aircraft was indeed damaged in some way. And there's one particular fact about these photographs that will no doubt work to do that. And that is that though the photographs clearly show this aircraft apparently intact, apparently undamaged at this particular airfield, they also show it in a different part of the airfield from the one in which it has been photographed before. So I'm going to say that after a period of quiet, a period of silence, the story will reappear, and we will probably hear stories or claims that what we're seeing, what today's pictures have shown, is a different A50U mainstay AWACS aircraft from the one that was damaged or destroyed. That one, the allegedly damaged or destroyed one, has presumably been covered up, hidden away, dismantled, flown to Russia, well, who knows what, and that this is the Russians trying to conceal the fact that they've lost this important aircraft. There isn't a scintilla of evidence to support such claims, should they be made, but as we've seen, some reporters who are covering this war now Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. So anyway, my conclusion, unsuccessful missile attack on this Belarusian airbase. Or rather, not missile attack, I should say drone attack on this Belarusian airbase, almost certainly carried out by Ukraine. Why have the Russians, by the way, not come out and refuted this story, which they could have easily done? I'm going to say straightforwardly, there's a very simple reason for this. Respect for President Lukashenko's political concerns. He did not want to acknowledge on the eve of a trip, an important trip to Beijing, that there had been a drone attack on an airfield in Belarus, because he's previously said that if Ukraine took action of this nature against Belarus, Belarus would be obliged to respond, and to respond strongly. And he doesn't want to take such escalatory steps at this time. They don't fit in with his own political priorities. And as I said, his priority at the time of this unsuccessful attack was his current visit to Beijing. So that's the simple, straightforward explanation for the Russian silence about this particular attack. Anyway, there we go. That's all I'm going to say about it. But I would make one point, which is that, of course, that attack on that airfield in Belarus with drones was part of a whole succession of Ukrainian drone attacks that we've now started to see take place over the last 36, 48 hours. Yesterday, there was, as I discussed, lots of reports about large numbers of Ukrainian drones. It's not quite clear how many, perhaps about 6 in total, launching strikes across Russia, various different places in Russia. It's been widely covered by the media in the West again. Many people talking about how these drone strikes show the depth, the extent of Ukraine's reach. What these reports don't mention is that this particular drone strike appears to have been a complete failure. None of the drones appears to have got through and hit their target. We know that at least 2 of them, according to the Russians, were brought down by electronic warfare techniques. And it seems that the Russians have gradually managed to get their air defense systems in a better operational state so that they're able to deal with these drones more effectively, even when these drones are launched from different directions towards widely separated targets, and even when different types of drones are used, so that the performance qualities of the drones differ substantially from each other. Well, that was yesterday, and this morning, reports of more Ukrainian drone attacks, but this time on Crimea. And the Russians this time say that up to 10 Ukrainian drones were launched against Crimea. 6 of them, the Russians claim, were shot down. 4 of them were again brought down by electronic warfare means, which, again, I'm going to discuss in a moment. Now, if we put all this together, that is a pretty substantial Ukrainian drone offensive over the last 3 days, which to all appearances has failed completely. I say that because, of course, the Russians have provided their account of it. There's been no corresponding account from Ukraine. There rarely is, by the way. But there's no information from the ground, from people in Russia, no commentaries on social media, for example, that suggest that any particular significant target was actually hit by any of these drones. Now, I would point out that when there have been drone attacks in the past, when targets in Russia have indeed been hit, like say the Engels air base in Russia a few weeks ago, the Saki air base in Crimea back in the summer, and when real damage was done, the information was all over social media in Russia very, very quickly. The media there was talking about it very, very quickly, and the Russian Defense Ministry had to admit that it was true and provided, in the case of the attack on Engels, some corroborative, some information about casualties. And subsequently, we had corroborative photographs from Western satellite companies. There's been nothing like that this time, and to be honest, on this occasion, I don't expect there to be. So, an unsuccessful drone offensive by Ukraine over the last couple of days. Now, I have seen suggestions that the purpose of these Ukrainian drone attacks is not so much to inflict actual damage as to get some insight into the state of Russia's air defense system, where the air defense batteries are located, and that sort of thing. I am becoming increasingly skeptical about this. I think that these attacks are too few and far between for Ukraine to get very much information about the operating systems and the deployments of Russian air defense missiles and radars. I think that they can get some information, but I don't think it is very much, and I don't think it is going to be especially helpful to them. The further thing I'm going to say is that the Russians now are using electronic warfare, which is some types of jamming systems, to bring Ukrainian drones down. And they've been doing it increasingly over the last few days. There have been reports, by the way, earlier in the war that they were doing it during earlier stages of the war as well. But they do seem to be doing it more effectively and more successfully now. Now, as in so many things, I am not an expert on electronic warfare. I mean, my conception of electronic warfare until a couple of years ago was that it was basically jamming. It was just sending lots and lots of signals, swamping the signals from the controllers back in, the rear who were controlling the drones, causing drones to drop from the sky or go off in all sorts of weird directions when the link with the controllers was severed. I'm told that drones, or at least very long-distance drones, don't actually work exactly in that way, that they tend to follow a pre-programmed flight path, and that it's only very occasionally that the controllers actually re-establish contact with the drones, precisely to avoid jamming of the kind I've just described. So if the Russians are jamming these drones and are able to do it from some distance from the targets, that suggests that Russian jamming devices are rather more effective than I'd assumed, and that they're able to interfere with the drone's control systems in some form. And I'm going to say something further. A couple of years ago, some years ago, certain US reconnaissance drones that were flying over Iran were brought down by electronic warfare methods. There were lots of speculations, by the way, that the Russians were behind it. And these American drones, what happened was that the people who were waging this electronic warfare, let's say the Iranians, not only stopped the drones, the American drones, doing what they were supposed to be doing, they actually captured the drones. They were able to take control of the drones and guide them to land essentially intact in Iran. And the Iranians were able to then take these drones apart, no doubt share technology, the relevant technologies, with their friends in Moscow and Beijing, and then reverse engineer these drones and produce their own. Now, I wonder whether something similar might be happening on this battlefield. There were, again, reports earlier in the war, especially at the time of the Kherson offensive. I remember reading a report in some Western media outlet, I think it was the New York Times, that actually discussed this, that the Ukrainians would send surveillance drones flying over the Kherson battlefields, only for the Russians' very sophisticated electronic warfare systems to essentially capture those drones so that the Ukrainian controllers would lose control of their own drones and they would then fly off and be absorbed and taken control of by the Russians. So maybe this is now happening with the bigger, presumably more sophisticated drones that are being used in carrying out these particular attacks. Well, if that is so, then of course these drones would presumably be guided by the Russians to Russian air bases, and of course Russian technicians would then do what the Iranians did with those American drones. They take them apart, find out more about how they worked, pass on the information to Moscow, and even more sophisticated electronic warfare techniques would then be developed on the basis of what was learnt about these drones, and information would no doubt be shared with Russia's allies, China, presumably Iran. Anyway, there we go. So, a big Ukrainian drone offensive over the last couple of days, but one that seems to have been a complete failure. Now, Ukraine has successfully used drones in the past. It's possible it may do so again in the future. There's always a chance that the Russians will be caught by surprise, or that the Ukrainians will find some way round. This is a war. Wars make the parties resourceful, and it's far from impossible. In fact, it's even likely that we will see more drone attacks from Ukraine against Russia in the future, and some of these will be successful. But nonetheless, I suspect that the Ukrainians will be very disappointed by the failure of this drone offensive. I think this was no doubt intended to make a big impact at a time when the situation in Bakhmut is going badly wrong, and clearly that's not going to happen. Lastly, I'll be very interested to see when or if our friends in the media in the West do finally admit that the Russian AWACS aircraft was not damaged and that Ukraine's drone offensive has failed. I'm not holding my breath. Well, that now brings me to what's going on the battlefields. And again, the main battle continues to be in Bakhmut. And I'm getting more and more reports, again, very difficult for me to assess or understand their importance, but I've seen now maps which appear to show Wagner assault troops very close indeed to Homovo, and to the point where they can actually take physical possession of part of the road, this one remaining road that Ukraine can still use to send supplies and reinforcements to their troops in Bakhmut. And even as the Russian advances around Bakhmut, which again, let me reiterate, they're spearheaded, at the very least they're being spearheaded by the Wagner organization forces. Even as these attacks make more progress, Ukraine continues to rush reinforcements to Bakhmut. Now, on the first point about the Russian advances, I've now received or seen claims that the lock on the Bakhmut trap will be closed within 48 hours. Not sure how that's worked out, how the estimate is. I even saw one report, by the way, which was some hours ago, which said that it would be 2 hours. Well, that period of time has come and gone, and there's been no announcement that the lock is indeed closed. So that was obviously, well, shall I say optimistic, or perhaps premature would be a more accurate word. But other reports from the ground suggest 48 hours, and these do seem to come from rather more serious people, perhaps better informed people, better informed about the situation on the ground in Bakhmut, and they do seem to suggest that, as I said, the lock is closing, that the road will indeed be cut at some point within the next few hours. Well, we'll see. But Ukraine is responding to these events by rushing reinforcements to the area. And there's been a number of claims, a number of assertions now from various Ukrainian officials that Bakhmut will be defended to the very last man. There's not going to be a retreat from Bakhmut. A Ukrainian official who is an advisor of Zelensky's did go on, I believe it was US TV, and was interviewed, and he said that Ukraine might withdraw its forces from Bakhmut if the military decided that this was appropriate. But again, he seemed to imply that this was not the intention at the moment. So Ukraine is throwing everything it can to try to hold on to Bakhmut. And I'm getting all kinds of reports now that Ukraine is also rushing troops to Chasov Yar, which is the town where the two Russian pincers seem to be intended to meet, and that these troops at Chasov Yar, supposedly, this is from Russian sources, rely principally or almost exclusively on Western equipment. And as I said a number of days ago, there are even rumours that some of the Leopard 2 tanks that Ukraine has recently received from Poland are also turning up at Chasov Yar. I've not, by the way, seen that report confirmed. But anyway, apparently General Syrskyi, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, its army, is taking personal charge. He seems to be intent on trying to hold on to Bakhmut come what may. And I have to say, I am deeply troubled by this. I wonder about the logic of this. But of course, the determination the Ukrainians show in holding on to Bakhmut, once again, in my opinion, exposes the falsehood that Bakhmut is not of strategic importance. By the way, there was a long article in The Guardian by its veteran correspondent Luke Harding, a reporter with, I'm going to say, a contentious record. I'm going to be very polite about him. Anyway, there was a long report by Luke Harding in which he said, Bakhmut, again, doesn't really matter. There's a very strong Ukrainian defense line further west, based around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and that the Russians are most unlikely to be able to reach the administrative borders of the Donbass. Well, if Bakhmut is as unimportant as that, why is General Syrskyi concerned? Why is he apparently taking personal charge? Why has the Ukrainian general who was in charge of the forces in Donbass been sacked? Why is Ukraine continuing to rush reinforcements to Bakhmut? Clearly this isn't the case. And I noticed that the Daily Telegraph, which is another British newspaper, is now quietly reporting that capture of Bakhmut will open the way for the Russians to capture the remaining cities in Donetsk region, which continue to be under Ukrainian control, which would of course include Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, implying that the defence lines there are not quite as strong as perhaps Luke Harding believes. Anyway, there we go. So Ukraine rushes troops to Bakhmut, tries to hold back the Russian advance, perhaps rotate some of the troops, though it's becoming apparently increasingly difficult to keep the troops in Bakhmut itself supplied. And we get reports of continuous Russian attacks, constant Russian shelling, Ukraine suffering more and more casualties. There have been some rather distressing claims. I can't confirm them, but Russian sources are saying that teenagers are now being found amongst some of the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers that have been sent into battle. Well, teenagers can mean many things, and many armies around the world rely on teenagers to form the core of their battle forces. The Soviet army relied on teenagers to some extent, boys in their 18 and 19, as I remember, during the Cold War. So perhaps we shouldn't read too much into that. But it is very, very tragic to think of these young lives being sacrificed in this way to defend what is, it seems to me, clearly an unsustainable position. But that, it seems, is what Ukraine is going to do. Now, I would not be providing a complete report of the information that I've obtained about Bakhmut if I didn't say that a Russian official has somewhat walked back the earlier claim that there was 7,000 Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. This official says that there's more than 3,000 of them there. If that's correct, then, well, maybe they've been reduced because of heavy losses, but hopefully, or at least I would like to believe, it's because some of them, or most of them, have retreated. Anyway, I ought to say that even as the pincers around Bakhmut gradually close, fighting within the town continues. The Russians continue to push forward, and it's clear that Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, no longer controls all, or perhaps even most of Bakhmut, even as, of course, officially it claims to do so. Anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut. There's been a cascade of reports also from Vuhledar, and these again tend to come from the Russian side. The Russians say that they've successfully absorbed and repelled the various Ukrainian counterattacks that have been taking place there over the last few days, and that they're pushing forward again. And once more, we hear that the Russian artillery fire in and around Vuhledar is enormously intense and extremely severe. And last but not least, Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, which is of course a constituent region of the Russian Federation, and who's also a lieutenant general in the Russian armed forces. Anyway, Kadyrov says that his forces, the Chechen forces in the Kremenaya area, have again been moving forward, and that they have again managed to capture various locations in Kremenaya, that the Ukrainians continue ever so gradually to be pushed back there. Though I get the sense that for the moment at least, the Russian offensive towards Kupiansk in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area has been put on some kind of pause, perhaps until the Battle of Bakhmut runs its course. You think about it from a Russian point of view, if Ukraine is pouring all its troops into Bakhmut, where they're being killed or wounded or encircled, then that actually works to the Russian advantage, and that it's better for the Russians not to pile on too much pressure in places like Crimea, lest the Ukrainians decide to keep their troops there rather than send them to die or get wounded or captured or be surrounded in Bakhmut. That's my own rather quizzical statement, if you like. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps that's not part of the Russian thinking. Maybe after the incremental advances that they've made in this area over the last couple of days, the Russians need to reorganize, bring up more artillery, bring up more ammunition, do all of those sort of things before they push forward. I can't definitely say. Now, on the topic of ammunition, the Russians are now reporting that there's been a significant slackening of Ukrainian artillery fire over the last few days, and that this is becoming very noticeable in places like Kherson, perhaps in Donetsk, close to Donetsk as well, in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area, even to some extent in Bakhmut. And this is reinforcing theories in Russia, which of course we can't confirm one way or the other, that Ukraine now is suffering from a shell famine, that shells are being distributed very carefully, that the use of shells is being rationed, and that Ukraine's ability to maintain effective artillery barrages is declining. I would also add, by the way, that over the last few weeks, I've noticed a decline both in the number and effectiveness of HIMARS missile launches. So it could be that despite all of the euphoric talk about Ukrainian advances, Ukrainian victories, the Ukrainians making great progress in many places, that things are actually not going terribly well for them, and that the ammunition shortages that we've been hearing so much about are now starting to have an accumulating effect. Well, there we go. Now, I have to say that for the moment there's been perhaps less in the way of political news, but there have been some very interesting articles that have been appearing in parts of the Western media, and I should say that these articles perhaps tell us a great deal about the thinking, neocon thinking, over the course of this war. Now, there's one particular article that stood out for me today. Well, actually, there's two, but let's start with this one. And this is from Richard Kemp, and it's in the Daily Telegraph. And it reads, "A total Russian collapse is surprisingly close." Now, Ukraine is been pushed back in Bakhmut. Its drone offensive, as we've seen, it's failed. It's having all kinds of problems, but it's apparently the Russians who are on the brink of collapse. And Richard Kemp begins by talking about as Moscow's latest offensive in Ukraine slowly but bloodily cranks up, the next phase of this ghastly war has well and truly arrived, and contrary to expectations, the Ukrainians are bravely and successfully resisting the tens of thousands of fresh Russian recruits being thrown at them. And then he goes on to say that contrary to what many people think, he expects that, in fact, Russians will collapse and collapse very quickly. And he provides a explanation drawn from General Ben Hodges, of how this collapse could be achieved, And it's isolate the Crimean Peninsula by precision strikes against the two land routes connecting it with Russian territory, the Kerch Bridge and the corridor that runs along the Azov Sea. Follow up with a large armoured drive towards the Azov, penetrating Russian defences north of Crimea, bringing rocket and artillery systems into closer range. And Russian air, ground and naval forces in the peninsula would then be reduced by precision strike and bombardment until the point when Ukrainian forces could launch a ground offensive along the Perekop Isthmus into Crimea. This concerted attack against the peninsula, isolating it, neutralizing it, and inflicting severe damage against its military infrastructure by long-range strikes would be a major blow for Russian morale. And it would represent a defeat for Moscow that it could not disguise and could lead to collapse of Russian forces in the field and even Putin's downfall. And then, of course, comes the caveat. But without boosting our support, it is unachievable. Even this more limited operation would demand massively increased Western assistance, including many more tanks than have been promised, much larger quantities of ammunition, as well as long-range missile systems, which so far have not been provided at all. Well, there we go. So, a pathway to victory. You can win, you can defeat the Russian army in the field. You can engineer a crisis in Russia. You'll bring down Putin. You'll achieve, in other words, all the objectives that the Neocons had right at the start of the war when they imposed these across-the-board sanctions. But you would need to massively increase military aid to Ukraine because, of course, without that aid, it is unachievable. Ukraine doesn't have the strength to do this. So here we can see the neocon logic, the logic of perpetual escalation. In a recent program which we did on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I said that the thinking of the neocons, the people, the political group that is very much in control of US policy, and their friends in London especially, is to, well, they won't retreat from any of their objectives, but on the contrary, to double down. And even as their plan of provoking a political crisis in Russia, of causing the fall of Putin's government through sanctions and economic pressure and diplomatic isolation, even as that great plan visibly fails, they will say, hold on a little longer, give more, and the plan will succeed. And here you have, just a day after we made that video, just a day after it was published on the Duran itself, an article in the Daily Telegraph which makes exactly those points. It says, hold on a little longer, go on supplying Ukraine with even more weapons. And our great objective, the overthrow of Putin, the destabilization of Russia, it will succeed. All we need to do is to massively increase our military supplies to Ukraine. And of course, note that, no concern here about potential risks. Risks are not even spoken about. There's no discussion, for example, about the fact that these would be reckless attacks, extraordinary attacks, an invasion of territory that virtually everybody in Russia considers Russian, which is to say Crimea. And that, as various Russian officials, including Dmitry Medvedev has pointed out, that such steps would actually, in terms of existing Russian doctrine, open up the legal route for Russia to actually use nuclear weapons to defend itself. If anything like this, the kind of plan that Ben Hodges and Richard Kemp and people like that are talking about were ever to be put into real effect. So there we go. That's one example of neocon thinking, and it's, to my mind, a good case study, a good case example of how some neocons approach these wars, how, as I said, they have no reverse gear, even as the situation, as I said, in Bakhmut goes from bad to worse, even as Ukraine's problems accumulate, even as there are now reasonably good reports, good reasons to think that Ukraine is running out of ammunition. Well, we're told that, in fact, Ukraine must be supplied with masses of quantities of more weapons until eventually, well, victory, some sort of victory, is achieved. Well, that's, as I said, that's Richard Kemp. But there's now also a very interesting article by Martin Wolf, and it effectively says the same thing. And he is writing in the Financial Times. And he says, the West must give Ukraine what it needs. This war is a vital national interest of European countries and the United States. And the war then goes on to say that even those who demand a negotiated settlement should realize by now that a necessary condition for this outcome is the realization by Vladimir Putin that the West will not allow him to absorb Ukraine into his empire. And then we're told that Putin still believes that he will eventually prevail, and he might even be right, because, to follow Martin Wolf, Western rhetoric is not yet matched by deeds. This renders the outcome of the war in doubt. And Justin Bronk of the Royal United Services Institute has recently written, Russia can be beaten on the battlefield this year, but only if Europe stops underestimating Russian resolve, accepts that it is in a long-term military contest with an aggressive and determined enemy, and invests now in industrial capacity and support to Ukraine at the scale that the stakes demand. And nor are military resources all that is required. Ukraine needs to sustain its people and its economy. And it goes on to say, Russia is physically unscathed. Its economy has also survived Western sanctions better than many hoped. I find the hoped really a disturbing word. But anyway, supposedly we need to crank up even more support for Ukraine. And buried in the article, there is the neocon mantra that for the West, values is the same as interests. That the defeat of Ukraine would be a defeat of Western values, and that cannot be allowed. And our values are, if Putin wins, who comes next? No line can be drawn between our values and our interests, whatever realists, and Martin Wolf puts the word realists in quotation marks, whatever realists suggest. Our values are our interests. This war is for a way of life built on the ideal of freedom from destructive coercion by thugs like Putin. This makes it our war too. So what are Mr. Wolf and Mr. Kemp essentially telling us to do? Well, I mean, to my mind, what it amounts to is becoming involved in an all-out war with Russia, because that's where their logic leads. I'm going to say straight away, I don't think even if Ukraine were to get the kind of equipment that Richard Kemp and Ben Hodges think, that it would be able to win a ground war in Ukraine. Whether it could achieve the kind of military offensive that Ben Hodges thinks it can against the Crimean Peninsula, well, I am not an expert on military matters. I think it unlikely myself, but who's to say? But if such an attack were to take place, I suspect all it would do would lead to a redoubling of the Russian effort and an intensification of the war, not its reduction, even if you put the very real danger then of the use of nuclear weapons to one side. And I think this is my view. I think it's the view of many people. It's the view of the authors of the Rand Corporation report that I've discussed so many times in so many recent programs. But for people like Kemp and Wolf, this isn't acceptable because our interests are our values. We may have launched all kinds of wars all around the world, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, wherever. Yugoslavia, wherever. We may have done enormous damage to all kinds of places. We may have led Ukraine into a war with Russia, which has been utterly devastating to it, which is resulting in tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being killed. But our values stand firm, whatever those are. And, I will say, Martin Wolf does set out what some of those values are, but I'm not going to discuss them. It's inviolability of frontiers, which, as I said, Yugoslavia might find interesting. Peaceful cooperation among states. Again, Yugoslavia, Syria, Libya, Iraq might all find that interesting. And democracy. Democracy, by the way, being, of course, the most important one. And, of course, when neocons talk about democracy, it's important to say always that it is a democracy that they define. Everything else really is unimportant, and it is a democracy that they define, and that they define according to their own perception of their values, which of course are the same as our supposed interests. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked with this. So, as I said, what Martin Wolf and Richard Kemp are telling us is that Ukraine is losing, because that's the underlying story of both of these articles. If you really take a step back and think about it, Ukraine is losing. And it can, however, win. But what it must get is everything. It must get fighter jets. It must get more ammunition. It must get more tanks. It must get more bombs. It must get more missiles, longer range missiles, missiles that can be launched deep into Russia. Notice Martin Wolf's rather troubling comment about Russia being unscathed. Of course, he links this to economics, but one feels sometimes that he would probably like it to go beyond that. Anyway, he wants all of those things, apparently, and so does Richard Kemp, that there should be essentially an all-out war. And he wants us to be involved. Of course, both Richard Kemp and Martin Wolf will insist that it's Ukraine that will do all the fighting. We'll just give them the equipment and they'll fight the Russians for us. We don't need to send our own troops in. But when you look at the scale of what they're proposing in terms of equipment and ammunition and such things, well, all I can say is that it's, to my mind, fanciful to think that you can send weapons in such enormous quantities and not in the end send men too. And when you elevate this war to the kind of existential point that Martin Wolf is doing, and which others have done, and say that it's our values that are at stake and that our values are identical with our interests, well, the logic will eventually take you inexorably to the point where you commit troops, because if the war in Ukraine is that important, how can you not do so? Now, I have to say, I find this thinking increasingly disturbing. I would also point out that it seems to me to be detached from the logistical realities that people like Alex Vashinin, Brian Beletic, myself, others have been talking about. We have Josep Borrell going around saying that the stocks of ammunition are almost depleted. We hear that there's shortages now of HIMARS missiles, that the United States is having difficulty putting together the missile battery, the Patriot missile battery, that it has promised Ukraine, that we've seen the saga of the tanks, the talk that hundreds of tanks would be sent to Ukraine, that then shrunk to 2 battalions worth, 88 Leopard 2s, except, of course, the Leopard 2s apparently are not going to be provided in those numbers for many months because, well, actually there aren't that many Leopard 2s, and a lot of them are not in particularly good condition. Only 30% of the German army's Leopard 2s are operational or operationally effective. And of course, we've had all that talk about fighter jets. The United States, by the way, has just ruled out providing training to Ukraine, training pilots for F-16s, which suggests that the Air Force, the US Air Force, has come down strongly against this idea, but that's a discussion for another day. But anyway, we have all of these problems, and of course people like Richard Kemp and Martin Wolf don't see them. I mean, they assume that the West can supply all of these artillery rounds, all these shells, all these tanks, presumably should deplete its own arsenals and then go over completely to a war economy itself, trying to outproduce the Russians, even as the Chinese appear to be mulling the idea of supplying the Russians with weapons at a time when China's industrial capacity is, as I've said in previous programs, apparently greater than that of the United States and Europe combined. Well, I find all this bizarre thinking, and I would add that people like Kemp and Wolf are talking about doing all of these things, committing all these vast sums of money, diverting production to weapons for Ukraine at a time when public support for the war is waning, particularly in the United States and Germany, when there's a festering political crisis in the United States, with more and more rumours of more and more investigations of the president and of his son, something which may be the reason why, by the way, the president is looking increasingly angry in some of his most recent appearances. That's a guess. And of course, there's now good reason to think that the German economy is in recession and the British economy is in stagnation. I read a very depressing article by the British historian Adam Tooze, in which he's discussed the extraordinary stagnation that the British economy has suffered since the 2008 financial crisis, and how that appears to be getting worse, But, we ignore all of that and we press on and fight in Ukraine because our values are our interests. Now, I've often tried to understand where this very strange thinking comes from and why it's become so entrenched and so powerful amongst some people in the West. Overall, at the height of US power in the 1940s and 1950s, the US officials were in fact very toughly realistic about US interests and understood very well that interests had to be kept separate from such a nebulous, indeed protean concept as values. Well, one reason, obviously, is because all of these people in Washington and London and Brussels sense at some level the ebbing of their own power and feel that the power of the West is in decline, and they see Ukraine as perhaps the last real chance to reverse that trend, to secure the global dominance of the West, and specifically of the United States, a United States which of course they must lead, and that is the reason why they double down, they increase their gamble, they increase their investment in Ukraine. I think that there is another reason, and it's been touched on in an email that I've just received, and it's a very, very confidential one. I'm not going to say more about it, but it tells me that there are people in Washington who have been saying amongst each other that some of these policymakers in Washington are descendants of people who came from Central Europe and who are haunted by the terrible tragedy that overwhelmed people in that part of Europe in the late 1930s and 1940s. And that as a result, they reduce everything to a situation of good and evil, right and wrong, and conceive of every crisis as a repeat of 1938. I've seen some reports in Britain as well, suggesting that one reason why parts of the British establishment are so fixated with this war is because, again, it's seen as some kind of atonement for the position Britain took in Munich in 1938, which led to the horrors which followed. Well, all I can say about that is that if that's the thinking that drives these people, then it isn't even thinking at all. It's based on a fundamental, flawed understanding of history. It's a completely inappropriate way to conduct policy, and following its logic, if it is even logic, it's not only leading to an unfathomable disaster, but it's making fundamentally wrong choices in Ukraine itself. Now, I'm not going to discuss in this program the internal politics of Ukraine. This is a, shall we say, a contentious subject. I think you all know why, and I think you all know what I'm referring to. But look at the other side. If we're talking about who brought the greatest tragedies in Europe in the 1940s to an end, it was overwhelmingly the men of the Red Army, whose grandsons and great-grandsons are the ones we, at least Richard Kemp and Martin Wolf and people like that, appear to want us to fight in Ukraine. Well, that's the end of this program. More from me soon. In the meantime, just to remind you, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.